Diamante y vivo en la ciudad de Monterrey, Nuevo León, México. Me dedico al arte de los títeres desde hace más de 30 años y ante la falta de información sobre las mujeres dentro de nuestra profesión, he convocado a participar en 3 censos. Los 2 primeros de mujeres mexicanas en el 2007 y 2014 y en el 2021 con alcance internacional. He creado la página web Mujeres en el Arte de los Títeres para que albergue la información que se va recabando de estos censos. Encontrar, escribir y difundir la historia de las mujeres se va volviendo una necesidad apremiante. Necesitamos tener elementos que nos permitan rebatir las múltiples historias escritas por los hombres sobre nuestro arte, donde nuestra presencia ha sido borrada o, con suerte, considerada como una anomalía, una excepción en el caso de las artistas, o como comparsas, pretextos para la acción en el caso de los personajes femeninos en el Teatro de Cachiporra. Con el objetivo de revisar estas historias, desde Mujeres en el Arte de los Títeres y en coordinación con Baúl Teatro y el 29º Festibaul de Títeres de la ciudad de Monterrey, abrí esta convocatoria para compartir vía internet nuestra experiencia y conocimientos en torno a este tema y ofrecer una lectura con perspectiva feminista del teatro tradicional poblado de protagonistas y referentes masculinos. Agradezco a quienes acudieron al llamado. Estamos generando un documento histórico y contribuyendo a que los nombres y aportaciones de las mujeres no sigan borrándose de la historia. Escuchemos a nuestras participantes. En este video documento contamos con la participación de Sue Eaton, del Reino Unido. Es artista, músico, titiritera de sombras e intérprete. Comenzó tocando música, animando a la multitud y embotellando, es decir, recolectando el dinero, para el tradicional espectáculo Punch and Judy de su compañía Hand to Mouth Teatro, en las playas del sudeste de Inglaterra, y ha sido una parte clave del diseño visual, la música, la publicidad y creación general de muchos espectáculos originales de marionetas desde entonces. Ha ilustrado libros para niños, incluido Punch and Judy in the Rain, y combinó sus habilidades ilustrativas y de actuación para presentar sus espectáculos y talleres de títeres de sombras en solitario, en escuelas y teatros. Aprendió a tocar la zanfona para acompañar su espectáculo de estilo medieval, Piggery Jockery, que ha viajado por todo el mundo, desde Taiwán y Corea del Sur hasta Estados Unidos y Canadá. Y el uso de este antiguo instrumento se ha convertido en un elemento clave en muchos de sus espectáculos. Sue Eaton trabajó en el Puppet Center de Londres en la década de 1980 y fue miembro del jurado de Arlene Howard for Puppet Design en el 2020. A Sue Eaton la conocí por 2 medios: por su participación en el censo de Mujeres en el Arte de los Títeres y por recomendación de otras titiriteras de Cachiporra. Cuando le escribí para invitarla a participar en este encuentro, respondió inmediatamente. Leerla y escucharla ha sido apasionante. La relatoría de su experiencia con Punch y Judy es parte integral de nuestra historia común. Así que celebro la vida de Sue Eaton y me congratulo de que esté presente en este encuentro para compartirnos su experiencia dentro de este arte. Juntas, estamos generando un documento histórico que servirá de referencia en el futuro. Somos parte de la historia y no permitiremos que nos sigan borrando de ella. Te escuchamos, Sue.
Hello, my name is Sue Eaton. I'm from the UK and I have worked as an artist, performer, musician and puppeteer with my partner Martin Bridle since we left art college in 1979. We call ourselves Hand-to-Mouth Theatre and we began our hand-to-mouth existence by busking with our Punch and Judy shows on the beaches of southeast England. This traditional style show has remained in our repertoire ever since, although it is now a very small part of what we do. So here are my thoughts about being part of a traditional slapstick style puppet show, in particular as a woman performing in a more commonly male type of comedy. First, I will define the term slapstick, then discuss the British Punch and Judy tradition before talking about my own experience as a performer. So, what is a slapstick? The slapstick is a stick made of 2 strips of wood which makes a loud slapping noise when it hits, so that a light tap seems like a forceful and comical slap. It is used to exaggerate comic effect in the traditional Punch and Judy puppet show. Slapstick comedy or slapstick humour describes a style of comedy which is visual, physical and exaggerated and is named after the stick. It often shows violence and mishaps which would be disastrous in real life, but when presented in such an outlandish, silly and unrealistic way, it becomes funny instead. So, what is a Punch and Judy show? This is a popular British entertainment. It's a glove puppet show about a lazy trickster character called Mr. Punch, who uses his slapstick and trickery to thwart the various characters who try to prevent him from doing what he wants. Now, over the centuries, different characters have come and gone, but these days, a show would usually feature his wife, Judy, and the baby, which represent responsibility, a policeman, authority, a ghost, death, the devil, religion, and somewhat bizarrely, a crocodile. Novelty music and trick puppetry interludes and characters are also often part of the show too. It is thought to be a combination of the travelling commedia dell'arte marionette shows and the traditional English glove puppet shows which became popular on the street when theatres were closed in the mid-17th century. The name of Mr. Punch is an anglicised and abbreviated version of the Italian Pulcinella, first Punchinella and then Punch. He traditionally speaks through a squeaky reed which the showman has in his mouth, which is called a swazzle, as does the Italian glove puppet Pulcinella. The diarist Samuel Pepys described seeing a show in Covent Garden Market, London on May the 9th, 1662. So this is now considered to be Mr. Punch's birthday and performers gather annually to commemorate this. So how and why did I become a performer? In Victorian England in the 19th century, beaches became popular places of leisure and entertainment, and the Punch and Judy performers followed the crowds from the city market squares to the busy seaside towns, thus establishing a tradition for us to slip into. Martin had grown up in a seaside town, so he was familiar with this, and he created his own puppet show in order to earn a living in the fresh air without having to be employed by anyone else. As a musician and a performer, I was keen to be part of this too. We saw it as a romantic way of life, a diversion from a normal career path, and a kind of freedom. And we are also folk musicians interested in folk art and folk customs and traditions, in popular art, circus, variety theatre, and the traditional Punch and Judy show encapsulated all of this. By collecting money from our audiences, actually busking for a living, we had to make sure that our shows were popular, funny and entertaining, so that our audiences kept coming back. They also needed to be loud and boisterous and quick-moving to keep an audience engaged on the noisy beaches full of fun-loving holidaymakers. Mr. Punch's shrill, squeaky voice travelled well and helped to attract a crowd. We were just starting out, and it was a good training ground. So my part in the show. I worked outside the puppet booth, and I was the public face of the show. I was the bottler, which meant that I collected money from the audience. Apparently the name comes from the money being collected in a bottle, which would be broken by the showman at the end of the day for the money to be counted, ensuring that no money could have been taken out. Mainly, my audience was happy to contribute. If not, I would try extra smiling or a hard stare toward non-payers off. And most people were pleasant, one or two not so much. As well as bottling, I did some barking. That means I fronted the show and interacted with the puppets and the audience. Sometimes I mediated between them, translating Mr. Punch's squeaky, swaddled voice. I played music and sang. I caught the baby if he was thrown out of the puppet booth and encouraged and occasionally reassured the young audience. Before the show, I walked up and down the beach wearing signboards and ringing a bell to advertise the performance. And afterwards, I sold the souvenirs, postcards, badges and colouring posters which we had made. I also looked after our baby son while performing and collecting the money on the beach, and he often liked to join in with the musical interludes, which was popular with our audiences. This continued when our baby daughter arrived too, although we were no longer working on the beach. They would often be dressed to match our costumes, and they would join in at the end of the show. Judy and me. So, I am not a slapstick performer myself. I am the friendly face between the show and the audience, the female face. I think my presence ensures that the show is family friendly, funny and safe. I myself have a strong memory of being a child watching a Punch and Judy show on the beach and being puzzled by Judy having a man's voice, the voice of the puppeteer. I knew she wasn't a woman. There is a tradition in the UK known as pantomime. It is unlike the pure mime pantomime shows of other English-speaking countries, although it shares its roots in commedia dell'arte. It's a big, spectacular and very popular indoor show, always on at Christmas, and usually based on a well-known traditional story like Cinderella, Aladdin or Jack and the Beanstalk. And it often stars well-known TV actors and celebrities. It follows a very particular pattern. The main male hero, the principal boy, is played by a good-looking young woman, and a comic female character, for example, Cinderella's ugly sister, is played by a man in drag. This is called the pantomime dame. Now we see our Judy as a pantomime dame. She's outrageous, strong and very funny and gives as good as she gets. We were aware of our audience of children and we wanted to make them laugh, not cry or feel frightened. But we also wanted to keep the energy and spirit of the traditional knockabout show. So tapping into the pantomime tradition, also a slapstick form, that helped. Men versus women in slapstick theatre. I cannot speak for other performers. I only know of our own situation. Our show is musical, absurd and funny, full of visual, knockabout humour and witty jokes. We aim to portray a show which is comical, energetic, in the tradition, but always funny and never cruel. Humour is always the main focus. We ask ourselves, is it funny? If the answer is no, the idea would be abandoned. We are a couple, we developed our style together. The puppeteer, Martin Bridle, is not an aggressive macho man, and I am a woman, and our own personal taste and sensitivity feeds into each routine as we try to keep it true to the tradition, but also appropriate to modern family audiences. We emphasise that the puppets are made of wood. They move in a lively way, but they knock against the side of the booth, against the slapboard, to make the wooden heads whack even more loudly. They are wooden-headed puppets, they are not real. If a puppet meets an untimely end, it will be in a ludicrous way, for example, being tricked into a sausage machine and turned into sausages, or sent flying out of the booth. Nor is it a real world. Like fairy tales set in a once-upon-a-time world, the Punch and Judy show is set in an earlier time, a nostalgic and absurd other world. Our own initial interest is nostalgic and romantic, and we were influenced by the TV comedy shows and entertainments of our childhoods in the early 1960s. Our show has inevitably changed to reflect changes in society, what is and what is not acceptable in comedy, a conversation which continues. For example, until about the middle of the 20th century, a small live dog would be part of the performance. But in our own lifetime, we have seen this become completely unacceptable in the UK. And so Dog Toby, as he would be known, is now a puppet, if he appears at all. He's a big feature in ours. In fact, we have two, father and puppy, old Toby and young Toby, who introduce the show in a generally daft manner. Changes in society. In the 1990s in the UK, Punch and Judy shows became less fashionable, with an awareness of prejudice and imbalance in various parts of British society. Some local authorities would not book Punch and Judy shows, or they remained popular amongst the population in general. After 11 years as buskers on the beach, we decided to stop. We felt we had taken the traditional Punch and Judy show as far as we could. We had 2 young children, and so we created another pastoral-style outdoor glove puppet show, which we performed for fees at rural events and folk festivals, etc. in the summer. It looked like an ancient traditional show, although it wasn't, and was much more subtle, incorporating traditional styles and slapstick routines, but different characters. We also worked in schools and theatres in the winter with larger scale shows. Punch and Judy was still in the repertoire, but no longer our main focus. It seemed to us that the show was at its noisy, anarchic best when performed on that strip of sand between the land and the sea, with all its wildness and freedom. As a visual artist, I have been inspired by Punch and Judy imagery. For our beach busking shows, I did most of the sign writing and painted the proscenium arch, influenced by fairground art and traditional sign writing. I also created publicity for the show and merchandise for selling. In 1984, Martin wrote and I illustrated Punch and Judy in the Rain, a children's book about the imaginary world in between the shows when it is raining on the beach, as it often was in an English summer. It was published by Hamish Hamilton, now part of Penguin Books. The story shows the haphazard backstage lives of the Punch and Judy Repertory Company rather than the traditional story. The style was influenced by Victorian woodcuts and broadsheets. And in 1987, I illustrated the cover for the British puppetry magazine Animations to celebrate the Punch and Judy show's 325th anniversary. I bent myself double to make Punch and Judy dance in a life-size puppet costume based on the Russian Nanaika dance that we regularly performed at Covent Garden for the annual Punch and Judy May Fair. And I continue to perform with Martin Bridle and have recently included Punch and Judy as a historical section in our children's theatre show, The Mystery of Memory Lane. Mr. Punch and his European cousins. Although we didn't do Punch and Judy shows very often, over the years we have been lucky enough to perform internationally at various festivals alongside Mr. Punch's European cousins, who share roots in the Commedia dell'arte. The Punch and Judy show is an unbroken tradition since 1662 and is held in high repute in these circles, often more so than in the UK, where it is not particularly valued. Often Martin did these festivals as a solo act, but sometimes we took our children with us and they performed in the musical parts of the show, thus emphasising the family-friendly nature. We were pleased to still be performing Punch and Judy internationally in 2019 before the global pandemic stopped everything. In 2022, the United Kingdom will be celebrating Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee, 70 years on the throne. Punch and Judy shows are in demand for street parties and celebrations, and it seems that despite the changing attitudes, the show still taps into a nostalgic view of Britishness and is part of the English folk memory. So we will take the puppets out of the suitcase and we will do it all again.